So my name is Peter Guy. I'm a Liability Data Management Director at CH2M. I've been working with EQuIS for over 10 years now, and I joined here a couple years ago to work on some really cool projects like the one I wanted to present here, and how we're using EQuIS not only out of the box, but to add some other features for clients. So this particular client, which we have to keep confidential, had a method by which they were using EQuIS to create standard reports that export from EQuIS, and they would put into an access system where they were doing their action level screening and calculating hazard risk quotients and all that there to rank their sites. Having met with them and understood the tool, we realized we could actually put this into EQuIS itself as a toolbar option and run, using a lot of the native functionality of EQuIS, all of their stuff internally, and then still add in the risk ranking and hazard quotient analysis at the end. And that would streamline their operations and allow them to just do everything within here and go straight to reporting, instead of the back and forth that they had sometimes with having to edit a sample, then let's say re-export it, go back to access and rerun everything again. So the whole goal of this was to try and take their entire workflow and streamline their processes and keep it all within one system. So this is the tool right here. Just added it as a toolbar within EQuIS. It brings up your operating window to start the workflow in this process. We have the workflow process highlighted through the steps up here at the top. And of course, there's a next button here at the bottom where we can just go through it. So just to start through this, there's a set of media that they're going to screen against action levels, and they can select one, or you can select multiple media. I guess there's no surface water here, so let me see. You can select multiple media, and you can select a single media, and then you can come into a sample editor, which was a critical part of their processes, because not always is the lab coding things correctly, and sometimes it has to be caught at this stage in the game when they're going into their risk analysis. And also, there's been some depth interval errors and other things that have come from the field, so this was a crucial part of the steps to them, is that to be able to do this. We made it so that you can edit samples at either the sample or location level. So if you had to put a reason code for the use of particular locations in their samples, whether to actually include them or not in the risk or analysis, and to set them versus categories they have defined as on-site, off-site, or off-property. All of that can be editable here. So all of the samples for a particular location can be edited in this one window. And likewise, if they have individual samples within the overall location matrix, they can come into the individual sample editor. And if they have a depth adjustment, a matrix adjustment, because sometimes the lab is calling, let's say, a groundwater or surface water, and then whether to include a sample in the overall risk calculations or not, can all be done here. This is a key feature for them too. Was the sample used or not? This is just a designation that is for this tool. We haven't set it so that it is let's say, like the detect or not detector, approved or not approved fields that could be affected in other EarthSoft reports. We used a custom field to designate this here for this particular tool. The reason for this is that they do run a lot of their samples through EQuIS and other standard reports to look at information in other ways. But for this particular case, we wanted to be able to select and screen in and out samples for the overall process based on the site conditions. So sometimes, let's say a cement pad was laid over somewhere, maybe they excavated in another area, added other filters to groundwater, for whatever reason, they've broken a pathway in the risk assessment process, and that sample should no longer be included. So this became an easy editor for them to come in here and say, yes, I want to include the sample or not, just by clicking on a button and then hitting save here at the end. So now that sample I've selected is actually going to be included in the risk process. So from here I can go back to the overall risk screening stepwise process. And one thing I wanted to note too here before we move on to the next step of the risk process is we have a surface and subsurface soil designation in here, and then you can pick the depth interval because it can vary from their individual site to site or even across the site what exactly constitutes a surface soil for various reasons. The lab was classifying everything surface soil, subsurface soil as just a matrix of soil per their processes and working in this particular client and what they do. So it became critical too here to have a depth horizon identified in this area. So if I click off the subsurface soil here and just have surface, it's going to take everything up to the 0.9 feet. Or meters actually, and I see the units in the window, and just use those samples and let you know whether the sample is designated for use in the risk process or not. And as I can show here, if I change this to 0.75, it'll automatically rescreen all of our surface soil samples down here to everything up to 0.7 as I have. Okay, so going back to, I'll just take a simple groundwater scenario here. These are all set for use in the risk screening process. I can go to the next step by clicking on the bottom button here or jump over to the calculation settings here. This is just a simple step in the process to decide which way they're going to go with calculating some of the data. All the calculations are set based on their processes within the tool itself. So the only thing the end user or risk assessor needs to know is whether they want to use average concentrations or a maximum value across an interval or within the samples for the groundwater, and whether they do not want to include detection limits within their overall risk calculations, or they're going to use half or use the full detection limit. So from here, this is a very simple process. We step into the next pathway, which is to select their guidelines, which have been broken out into on-site, off-site, they're off-property, and what we call a future guideline. And a future guideline is just a future use scenario based on current conditions, that if you had a parcel, let's say you wanted to sell off, that's where the future guideline scenario comes in based on current conditions in the foreseeable future. This is how the risk screening would work and the criteria that are set for that. We also ended up with a guideline editor in this process of developing a tool for them so that they could come in here and make simple changes to the guidelines when they are in this part. This is actually using the guidelines straight from the action level grouping here that EarthSoft had set up in their toolbar. So they can be overall managed here, and you can affect your guidelines here, but as long as you're already in the tool, instead of having to drop out of the tool and go back to the action level editor, they wanted some of the features that were critical to them available here too. And again, that's adding action level notes to define things as carcinogen versus not, and also if there's been a change to the actual action level or correction that someone needs to make to their various values. You can also add a guideline in here, and you can pick one of the existing ones if you need to make changes here as well or add chemicals, or you can actually use the guideline here and follow this naming convention here that has been set up so that it follows along with their overall process workflow. And you can just hand type in the guideline here and go from there to the next stage of selecting your analyte and then actually putting in the guideline in ppm. As I think everybody's familiar, it's not really something you want to do a lot of guidelines that you have to add or manage everything that way, but it's a quick editor if you just have an analyte or two to add or a quick setup you need to make. Obviously, I think most people that use EQuIS do import action levels with EDP, and that same process would work here. It's the same action level EDP format. We can put all the guidelines into there that are, work with this tool and then just upload them to EQuIS as well. Okay, so I'll return back to the screening workflow, and from here, the end user can pick whatever use case scenarios they have going on. I'll just pick a quick on-site and off-site guidelines, and from on-site, we pick the agency, and any number of agencies can be in here. We have more than this, but this is just a quick from our demo environment setup. Pick a land use type, which is critical in this risk process that was set up by the client. And I'll pick agriculture here for the offsite. And then if there's a soil texture, if we were doing soil, you can add that in too, because that factors into their overall risk calculations. And I'll just set those to NA. What you see happening here is I picked as each of the guidelines, the agency, the land use, and if there's a soil texture type applied, it actually picks up the different pathways and guidelines that we need to apply automatically down here. So I can come down here and say, I'll take my fresh glyphosate. In fact, I'll just take the first 4 guidelines, and then I can add those over into the next window. So these are the guidelines I'll be risk screening against with the samples I chose back in my first step, and these are the risk pathway guidelines I'm choosing to ignore for this particular risk calculations. So from here I can go into next, and then this is going to take us into the reporting window. These reports were specifically set up by the client and the specific output that they were looking for in their overall risk ranking process. These are all running reports through SQL in the back end, and these all and through this interface as well, which this is a library file just placed in the overall EarthSoft workflow or EarthSoft EQuiS folder that's on your C drive during install. So it was really a simple way to add this to whatever machine that for the risk assessors they want to use this on, because whatever calculations and specific additions to queries we did are all done in the SQL Server end, but the overall tool and functionality itself is done through a .NET library that can be distributed to the people who need this. So instead of going through the actual reports here, because I'm working off our development environment and it's very slow, I don't want to hold up time just by waiting for this to process the calculations. I have a risk output sheet here that we ran earlier. From a test case scenario, as you can see, all of the exceedances from the run are being highlighted here. You have your samples. Well, you have your pathway, your guideline, your pathway, receptors here, like in this case, it's ecological for this run, direct contact, your chemical, what your concentration was, the action level from the guideline, and the calculated component risk for that analyte. We've also played around with a couple of pivot tables and crosstabs for the client still under review to decide how they actually want to review it. So there's the grid, and we're trying to look at a couple other options for reviewing the guidelines too, and looking at the risk as it's broken out across the various criteria that are all in columns here. This is a part of their standard output here too, is to summarize all the exceedances, again showing their pathways and their receptors, soil media type, and their land use that they've chosen earlier in this process. Show each chemical and its concentration that had an exceedance and the component risk calculated with it. They also have another tab in their report, which is for future exceedances. And again, that's for, let's say, a parcel of land they want to sell or transferring in a case, or they just need to know what their future risk would be based on current scenario to retaining property or whatever their needs are. So that's when there's a future risk scenario that's different from the on-site, off-site receptors, then these two will actually vary. And in some cases, though, the future risk and the on-site receptor risk and everything are the same, so they end up being the same there as they are in this case. Next step is go over to a combined composite risk score for each of the analytes for their particular station that we're testing. And then they give the scenario here, which is the future risk scenario. Scenario 1, these are all defined specifically for their workflow processes, and these can all be, redefined too if we were to use this for some other scenarios and other risk cases and calculations that other people might have. But the scenario 1 here, I guess, if I remember correctly, is they're on-site, off-site. Then they have scenario 2, like an on-site, off-site. I forget what the next level is, but they have different combinations of the scenarios that they combine in here, and we get a composite risk off of that for each analyte. So anything essentially above a value of 1 turns out, and as it increases, that's worse. So any value above a certain level, then you get your composite risk there, and then it can be developed into this last tab, into their site scores, which they use to overall evaluate their sites for risk and needing to be addressed through remediation. So again, the higher the site score, then the worst case scenario. And this is all just sample data. So I'm not pointing to any particular risk in any actual site here. And that's the tool in a nutshell, and the quick overview of it. It's really just very straightforward and simple. Took their workflow processes, contained it all within EQuIS so they could do here, and uses a lot of the native functionality and reporting from EQuIS. And what we did is added the risk calculations and some specific reports the client wanted to see on top of that, all contained within a direct link library we can add to any machine for the client. And then they just open it up for the first time. This toolbar button will be added, and they can get started.
Thanks, Peter. And it looks like Kathleen has a question here. So Kathleen asks, does any of this risk functionality exist in third-party tools, or were the requirements unique enough to warrant complete custom development? I added the complete, Kathleen, but.
So their risk requirements were unique. I know there's the Risk 3T and other tools out there, but that was not satisfying their needs. So they went to some other developer and developed the entire workflow risk analysis and calculations you just saw in EQuIS completely in an Access database. And the workflow used to be that this would be, EQuIS would be used to query the data, run the reports, and then they would get it out in a specific format that they would put into that Access database and then run through all these steps. What this is doing is saving them the step of looking at the samples and the values and everything I showed you at various steps and deciding that, oh, wait, we don't want this sample in here. This one was actually cut off the risk pathway, so it shouldn't be included. So they can come in here and sample editor, click off a particular sample, and hit save, and then, again, come back to the risk screening window and be ready to go right away to the next step, as opposed to having to go back into EQuIS, reselect all their samples, run the report, import it back to Access, and start their process over.
So then Ed asks a couple of questions. Ed asks, first, how is the risk score calculated?
The risk score itself is calculated based on their criteria that they provided us. Can't really go into more detail than that unless I go back to the original design document and look at what exactly they were putting into it. And I can't really do that here because of the confidential client.
Sure. And then Ed also asks, he says, it doesn't appear that there are any statistical analysis performed on the results. Is he missing something?
No, I don't think there is any difficult statistics going on here, although that could have been included in the criteria and the equations we put into it. It is some just basic algebra.
Kathleen had a comment to her question earlier when you answered it. She said, very nice. And then Jennifer asks, she says, not sure if you already mentioned it, but does this tool utilize standard EQuIS database tables, or are new tables added to the structure to use this tool?
We utilized all standard EQuIS functionality. We didn't have to add any other tables. We got by with the standard tables and using some of the custom fields and defining them specifically for this tool.
And then Brian asks, and this might actually be a question for me, but Brian asks, is there any EQuIS documentation for creating our own custom forms and reporting? And Peter, I'll let you answer that from your experience first, and then I can add more detail.
The answer is there's some. We got information for how to put the right code into our library file to get the form to show up here, and some basic structure guidelines that they gave us. But then after that, really it was all of our functionality from there on out. And I guess in thinking about this further, I did want to elaborate further on why we use the native X functionality. We didn't add tables to do anything else, and that's because during the discussion with the client, it was very critical to them that the tool that we put in here is not going to add a lot of custom tables and other things that would have to be maintained with EarthSoft and to avoid conflicts during upgrades in the future. They really wanted something that, when they move from, I think they might even be on an earlier version of 6, like let's say I'm using 6.3, they might have been still on 6.2 or whatever versions people are using. They just want to be able to upgrade the version and the tool still works without having to have problems with the custom tables or not. So that was a critical feature to them that was during the design document stage and how we're going to do this.
Just as a follow-up, Brian, to your question, the little bit of documentation that Peter mentioned, I can send out to folks along with when we do the recording. Another thing I wanted to mention is we're actually doing a couple of EQuiS Academy courses coming up, specifically on adding things to the toolbars, custom forms, things like that. And you guys can either sign up to attend them live, of course, or the recordings will also be available shortly after. So I'll include some details about those when we send out the recording as well. And then Ed has another question. He says, what does QuEST stand for?
Good question. I've heard that cool name that the client came up with this whole time, and I've never bothered asking him what that meant. I can tell you, though, that this little symbol here was designed by our own RAS team lead here, Tom Battenhouse, came up with that design on his own, just out of the blue as a placeholder, actually, and the client loved it. So it stuck.
So Kathleen's wondering where the custom SQL is. Is it in the .NET code, or is it in like a custom function or a stored procedure?
There is some stored procedures we created actually in the SQL database itself, and the rest of it's all in the .NET.
Peter, thank you very much for presenting, even with your cold, and thanks everyone else for attending, and we hope to see you at the next office hour.